Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we're going to do a couple things here, and just so you know too, if you got the wrong link to for the for the 9:30, if you're in the 8 o'clock class, that's okay. This is going to be recorded, and I think what I'm going to do in the future is I'm just going to put the links for both the 8 o'clock class and the 9:30 class up, and either one that you want to attend is fine. So if you have to, if you have to leave after a certain time, that's fine. These are both going to be recorded anyways, and it's the same exact class. So make sure everybody to go ahead and hit your chat button so that I can answer any questions and that we can have some interaction here. So the first thing I just want to do here is first to introduce, I'm sure that a lot of you have already gone through these or seen these. If you go to the files, these are things that we'll do throughout the semester. I'm going to go ahead here and not today, but we'll probably post some other things here. These are just some exercises that we'll do. Like this first one here, you don't have to worry about the annotated bibliography until the end of the semester, the final project. We'll do some other exercises here though, the apostrophe exercise. We'll go through some comma splice exercises. There's only one up here right now, but to be honest, we'll probably have some more because comma splices are probably the #1 mistake that freshman students make. And it's very easy to make, but it's basically when you have two, what we call independent clauses, and sometimes students just try to combine them into one sentence by splitting them with a comma, which you shouldn't do. It's called a comma splice. So we'll go through those. We'll have some editing exercises, and these editing exercises that we'll have are actually from real students in the past. And it's anonymous for the most part. Although if you go down here, Kiana from last semester, she gave me permission to go ahead and post her whole paper. I'm not sure which essay this one is. It might be the second one, but we'll have some other exercises here as we go through, like, fragments and misplaced modifiers and things like that, punctuation exercises. And of course, we have the syllabus up here as well. And we'll have a sample paper for editing. So we'll do some exercises here. We might even have a whole class before the first essay is due or before the second essay is due, where we'll just go through Kiana's paper up here, or we'll go through some editing exercises here. And of course, the slides from last class are up there, student examples, and so forth. The thing for this week to focus on is just the reading assignment. We'll kind of go through some of this today, but basically just write about a 1 to 200 word. I mean, if you want to go more than that, that's fine. But just 100 to 200 word response to each of these questions. So after reading the first few chapters of our textbook, what are some things that you can take away from it, or maybe pick a passage and explain how you found it interesting and relevant to the writing process and how it might guide your future academic writing. And some of the things that they talk about in this textbook, you can even write about how, well, they brought up this point, and this is something that I've always done incorrectly in the past. So that's fine as well. And then you're going to read an article from Blanda. The article starts on a few pages before 217, but the questions are on 217 and 218. And just pick one of those questions and write a response to that. And for a lot of the reading assignments that we'll have, it'll be similar format. Like we might read a couple articles from the textbook and then maybe just compare them or something like that, or read an article and answer a couple questions, something like that. The Blanda article is a good article, especially for these days as we get close to the election season. And it's just about how the other side is not dumb. So whether you're talking about a political argument or a social argument or what have you, sometimes the mindset is, well, my opinion is right and everybody else is wrong. Well, Blanda encourages you to always consider the other side and the counter argument, which we'll kind of talk a little bit about today, and how that can be important for your essays. Now, I want to quickly talk about, whoops, sorry about that. quickly talk a little bit about the essay. Now, this isn't up for you yet, so it's not available, but I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up about what the first essay is about. And essentially write a 3 to 4 page paper that's about 1,000 words or so on what your major is or your intended major is. I mean, even if you're not set on a major, which is fine, because I assume that everybody here is a freshman, although some of you might be sophomores or juniors and you took your other classes first, but I assume that most of you are freshmen, and at this point you might not have a major, which is totally fine. It's very common. I mean, I didn't pick a full major until probably my junior year. I had different ideas and went through different, I had like 4 majors before I finally decided on one. So that's fine, but just pick a major or something that you're interested in, maybe a possible major that you're thinking about, and just explain, okay, what makes this field important to you? Why did you choose this field, or why are you thinking about choosing this field? What are your career goals that you want to get out of it? What skills do you need to have to reach your goals? What impact does this field have on society as a whole? So this last bullet point here, I know that a lot of you are nursing majors and are going into the medical field. So this is very important, this last bullet point. What impact does this have on society as a whole? Because, you know, everybody in society needs medical attention, needs doctors, needs nursing. So what impact does your field, the nursing field, have on society as a whole? And how is it beneficial for society? And it's different maybe than other fields because you are, I mean, not to say that other fields aren't important, but you have a direct impact. Hold on, give me 1 second. I apologize. My cat. Hey. Sorry about that. But okay, so Wesley asks, what if we have 2 different majors? You can focus on two different majors if you want. You could talk about 2 possibilities, or maybe just pick one of them. So, but yeah, if you're considering 2 majors, and for some people, you have a major, you're obviously going to have a major and a minor, right? So that's fine if you want to focus on 2 things. But if you just want to focus on one thing, that's fine as well. And these are just some general tips down here where we see have a good hook or opening attention grabber. So a lot of times you might want to start with a question. So an example might be, why is nursing important? Just something simple like that that kind of grabs the reader's attention. You obviously want to introduce a clear thesis statement. You want to address the counter argument. Now, the reason why this 3rd bullet point here is important is because, so yeah, you can see the due dates. If you go to the assignments, Yadlin, you could see the due dates. This isn't actually open for you yet, but I'm just kind of giving you a heads up as to what it's about. Now, the 3rd bullet point, though, I just wanted to address is the counter argument is important in a couple different ways. Because first of all, you want to have credibility to what your argument is. And this will make the reader think, okay, so this person knows what they're talking about. They're talking about both sides. The other thing is that it also will add length to your paper. So in one example that I can give you from, this is actually from Valencia, but a student, now their assignment was a little bit different than yours, different class, but their assignment was to write at least a 7-page paper on a topic. And I had one student that said, oh my gosh, how am I gonna write 7 pages? And it's not that hard if you also talk about the counter argument. And it's like, if you have to write one paper on like a certain book, for instance, well, you might have one opinion about the book, but it might be difficult to write a whole like lengthy 7-page paper on that. But if you also talk about why some people disagree with you or what some people think, that will open your eyes and that will help you add length to your paper as well. And later on this semester, I'll show you a chart too, which is going to be very helpful in terms of this. And after showing the student this chart, he was like, oh, okay, it was very helpful. And now I see how I can do that. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention about this first paper is that I'm going to actually add a different topic. So I'll do that before you have access to this assignment, but just a heads up as to what that topic is. I'm going to give you the choice. If this first topic, what your major is, doesn't appeal to you, or if you want to write about something different, I'm going to give you an alternative topic that you can write about, which is about social media and how it affects society. And it's something that you can have an opinion about, that's something that people will disagree with. So for example, if you are talking about how social media is bad for society because it maybe decreases people's attention span or whatever it might be, okay, that's one argument, that how social media has a detrimental effect on society. Or you could also talk about how social media is helpful and beneficial to society because it allows people to interact more, it allows people to connect with different people across the world. If you take Facebook, which, let me just kind of throw this question out just out of curiosity. How many of you still use Facebook? And you could just type in the chat box. I'm just curious. Okay, it looks like a few people, but I know that a lot of young people these days don't use Facebook anymore. Because you guys are younger, a lot younger than me probably, but I remember probably 5 years ago, Facebook, like everybody was on Facebook, and now it's just become something that a lot of older people use now, but not so much younger people. I mean, like I said, I'm older than you, so I remember the days when, way back in the day, there used to be something called Friendster, and then there was MySpace. MySpace was like the old equivalent of Facebook, right? So you guys were probably too young to remember MySpace, but now it's like a kind of a music site, but it used to be just like Facebook is now. But you could also make an argument with social media about how Facebook or other social media tools will allow you to reconnect with people that you haven't seen before. So if you are a little bit older, you haven't seen your old friends from high school, now it might give you the opportunity to reconnect with a lot of those people. Okay, so I know that last time we didn't really have too much of a chance to interact, obviously. In fact, even this morning, we had a brief disconnection with Zoom. So hopefully that won't happen here. Now, we're not gonna have time to do this, but in class, what I'll usually do, and let me just kind of throw this question out here. You can just type in the chat box. What are some reasons, you don't have to write down 10, but just think of some reasons. Why do you think this aspect of communication, which is writing, why do you think that that's important? And I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that and maybe write down something in the chat box. Why do you think that this idea of writing is important for society? I mean, just think of any answers that you can come up with. Exactly, it allows you to express your belief, Valerie says. And also, if you could, to Valerie's point, it allows you to express your belief. To compare writing with speaking, sometimes writing can actually be more effective than spoken communication when you think about it. Because think about it this way, as an example, right off the top of my head. But think about it this way. If you are meeting somebody face to face, you might have like an argument with that person. And it might get heated and it might be ugly and everything like that. But if you are writing like an email to somebody or you're texting somebody, it might give the other person time to think about how they want to respond to that, right? Instead of just blowing up in their face, maybe a written message might be better. And some other answers too, it helps us document our history. Yes, absolutely. I think in the last class, I gave the example of how in one ancient civilization, there were written documents that people didn't uncover until decades or centuries later, and they had different perspectives of the facts, actually. And also to Alanis's point about how it helps document our history, I mean, think about it. If we didn't have written communication, we wouldn't know anything about history, perhaps. I mean, just go back to the Revolutionary War, for instance. If we just told stories about that to people one generation after another, we wouldn't have the same information that we have today. But written documents help to document that history. Also, people can look back at history through, exactly, Jason. And it's another form of communication, able to talk to somebody, exactly, all good reasons. Yep. So maintain our ideas and memories, right? So some of you might have a diary or journal, and it may help you remember certain things that happened in your past, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Now, I'm just thinking right off the top of my head, in high school, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the book Where the Red Fern Grows. It's like in my high school, we had to read that. But I remember that the opening of that book starts out with an old man, and he like looks at a picture or just reads his journal. If I recall, it's been a long time. But anyways, and then it kind of flashes back to his childhood, where he sits down and he remembers that experience that he felt with those two dogs, Little Ann and Old Dan. I don't know if you guys ever had to read that, but it's a good book. Okay, so remember that when we talk about that there are different types of writing. So there's informal writing, which might be writing a blog, something like that. It doesn't have to be professional. You don't have to worry about spelling and grammar so much. I mean, like literally, like right now in our chat box, this is a form of informal writing, right? Just kind of like almost conversational. Formal writing would be maybe like an academic paper. Now, creative writing is also a form of writing. Some of you might want to go into the creative field, such as writing a novel, or writing a screenplay, or writing like music, or something like that. Later on this semester, if we get the time to do it, I'll show you examples of creative writing and some templates that you can follow if you're interested in that. Also, I'll show you too how you can publish your work. We might have a whole class on that too. And also with technical writing. Now, technical writing, some of you might be going into the fields of like computer science or information technology or engineering or something like that. Now at UCF, I used to teach a class called Writing for the Technical Professional. And it's a class where it's like a junior class where these students have already taken 1101 and 1102, or maybe not 1102, but they've already taken like English 1101. And they come in with this attitude that why is writing important? And keep in mind that these are like engineering students, computer science students, information technology students, and they think, oh, well, I'm not gonna have to write in my field. All I'm gonna be doing is writing codes, getting hands-on training and stuff like that. But what's really fascinating is I show them this video where these researchers go out to the West Coast. And as many of you are familiar, the West Coast, you have Microsoft, which is based in Seattle. San Francisco is where Google is based, although they have places everywhere, but a lot of these tech companies are based out in the West Coast. So anyways, these researchers go out there and they interview these workers from Google and Apple and Microsoft and so forth. And a lot of these people that they interview are relatively young. They're right out of college, and they interview all these people, and the people respond. They're like, I never thought that writing would be so important to my job, because I thought I was just going to be doing codes and things like that. But it turns out that the majority of what I do on a day-to-day basis is writing, whether it's writing reports for maybe potential investors or other colleagues, whether it's writing emails to communicate with other people that I work with, maybe people different locations around the country or around the world, and writing out technical reports and things like that. And so the point though is that writing for whatever field that you're going into is going to be important. And also later on this semester or two, we're going to have a whole class on resumes and cover letters. And I'll show you some tips and tricks. And if you write a cover letter that has a million typos in it, a lot of times it's just going to be tossed in the trash, right? So writing is important for any field and to get a job in the first place. Also, writing for conferences down here is something that you might want to consider, because here in Orlando, we do have a lot of professional conferences that take place. A lot of them are at the hotels here and so forth. I mean, I used to go, I haven't been in a couple of years, but I used to go to one called the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts, which used to be in Fort Lauderdale, but now it's here in Orlando, the Marriott down by the airport. And it's great because you get a chance to network with people from all around the world, you know, hence the name International Conference. And you have also a lot of famous people that show up to these conferences. I mean, like Stephen King went to the conference or spoke at the conference one of these years. And so you get opportunity to connect with a lot of people and to just relate to a lot of people and present papers sometimes for a conference. You might do a conference paper and it looks great on your resume. So that's something that you might want to consider. I mean, probably not as freshmen at this point, but as you go on in the future, that might be something that you might want to consider. And like I said, it looks great on your resume. And the great thing too about conferences is that a lot of times students are intimidated when they see people, you know, like Stephen King, for example, like I said, a lot of people are intimidated when they see people like that and they think, oh my gosh, if they're sitting in and I'm reading my paper, I'm just going to be intimidated. But you'd be surprised that at a lot of conferences, at least the one I'm talking about, the people in the field are very supportive of students. In fact, obviously they used to be students themselves. So don't feel intimidated. I mean, at one time, the very first conference that I went to, I was a little bit intimidated because one of the guys many conferences, you're sitting with three people and each of you are reading the paper. And the guy that I was next to was relatively famous. And after we read our papers, I did mine. Somehow we got to be talking about Back to the Future and actually and Blade Runner, which is what I wrote my paper on. And I was kind of nervous because the questions came up and he actually intervened and started helping me out, answering questions and so forth. So don't be intimidated by these conferences. And like I said, it looks great on your resume. Also, poetry is a form of writing. Has anybody ever written any poems, or is anybody a poet by chance? Maybe, maybe not. Also, letters, of course, we don't really write letters in the mail so much anymore, but of course we have emails and stuff like that. So all these things are considered forms of writing. Okay, and once again, we're not going to have time to get in groups in a classroom setting, but as we usually have the students compare answers, like the three most important things about writing. And of course, you guys gave some great answers up here. I mean, all the things that you said are important, and there could be, you know, things like, as we said, writing for the professional world, writing technical reports, things like that, writing for assignments, obviously in college, and so forth. Okay, so let me just throw this question out here for the chat box. What do you think the cliched answer to the question, what is critical writing? What do you think most students say to that? Any answers or guesses? Again, no wrong answers here, but what would be the cliched answer to this question? Okay, yeah, writing about something important. Important writing. exactly. These are some of the things that come up off your mind, off the top of your head, of course. But perhaps a more defined answer to that question, what is critical writing? Well, it involves things like not only writing important writing, but writing more, more in depth. It means maybe consulting outside sources and doing research and taking those sources and figuring out how you can fit in there. In the last class, somebody just answered, well, criticizing. Well, that's true, that's true. But when you think of the term critical writing, don't just think about criticizing a thing or an author or what it might be. But yeah, Valerie, as Valerie says, getting deeper into the topic and things like that. So it's not just criticizing, because in the college setting, again, it might be a little bit different than high school, but in the college setting, you're going to be a little bit more, the authors that you'll read are going to be very established in the industry that you're writing about, etc. So you're not necessarily criticizing them or insulting them, but you're respectfully criticizing them, perhaps, right? Or sometimes you're just agreeing with them partially, but not completely, of course, right? So also, this is just, I'm going through some of the slides that we went through last time. But so Carrie asked, will we read any novels in this class? No, unfortunately, this is not really a literature class. In a way, I kind of wish it was, because, man, I'd love to give you some great books to read. But basically in this class, though, it's going to be mostly essays from the They Say, I Say book. And when you do your research later on, you'll be reading like academic articles and so forth. So that should answer your question, Carrie. But also, if we take a look here, look for nuances. You can always look at a topic in deeper terms. So I think like last time in the class, in the session last time, we looked at like, should college be free? Well, the immediate answer that comes to mind for all of us here in this classroom is, yeah, of course, that would be awesome, right? But then you think about how maybe in a way, I mean, it would be good for us, but at the same time, it might not always be good for us, because if everybody can get an education, then it kind of devalues it. So you go to apply for a job and maybe you worked really hard in college, got a degree, but then somebody who didn't work hard in college also has a degree, and maybe they get a job that you don't. And so you have to think of it maybe in terms of that. So always look for the deeper answers or different nuances into a topic. And then I also give the example of Jonathan Franzen, but this really applies to like anything, and not just authors too, but when you're looking at like music, for example, if you go back in the famous song from the early 1970s, I think, maybe late 1960s, called American Pie by Don McLean. You guys have probably heard it, even if you don't recognize the name. But anyways, on the surface, it kind of sounds like, oh, these high school guys, and maybe it's a love story too. But really, if you look deeper into that song, it's really about what was happening in the music industry, the rock and roll industry in the 1950s, 1960s. And like when he says the day the music died, what that refers to is the famous plane crash where the Big Bopper and Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens died in. And that's the day that the day the music died. And I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard of Ritchie Valens, but he was a kind of a tragic story, because he was a Latin American musician, and he always, and there's a famous movie, I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen it, but it's from the 1980s called La Bamba. And of course, he was the writer of the song La Bamba. And tragic story, he, not to get too far off on a tangent here, but he always had a nightmare growing up. He would have dreams of dying in a plane crash. And so for his whole music career, well, young music career, because it was really young, but in his music career, he would never fly in an airplane because he was just scared of it. And then, unfortunately and ironically, the very first time he ever flew in a plane, it crashed. And I mean, a very tragic story, because after playing a show, him, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper, it was like freezing cold, and they were going to take a bus, and Buddy Holly convinced Richie Valens, he's like, hey man, it's going to take forever to get back. We might be trapped with traffic in the snow and so forth. So let's just fly. And unfortunately, the plane crashed. But anyways, though, moving on. So as I mentioned last time, make sure to challenge your sources. So you don't have to have an argument that is the polar opposite of what somebody says. You can partially agree with an author, and you could say, well, they're right about this, but I would also add this, or I slightly disagree on this level, or something like that. So always think of ways that you can maybe put your voice into the conversation. Now, your textbook here gives templates, and they say in the textbook that it's always a great way to start off an essay, or to look at some of the templates that they give you. This whole book, before they get into the essays, or a lot of the book, I should say, is about these templates that they give you that you can use. So it's a good starting point for starting an essay. And so like somebody in the last class, I think, brought up screenplay. And keep in mind that when you write a screenplay, there are certain templates that you have to follow in the industry. There are certain, like, for example, you have to use Courier New in your font. There are certain programs that you have to use. There are certain guidelines that you have to follow, and so forth. So, I mean, whatever industry you're going into, a lot of times there are templates to follow. And just remember that entering a conversation does not mean that you have to start from the beginning of what an argument or subject is talking about. So in high school, a lot of times you might have to, like, let's say, for example, you're in a history class and they tell you to write a summary of the Civil War. Well, you might do that paper starting off with 1861, of course, and finishing with 1865, and just kind of giving a brief summary of what those events were. But in college, it's a little bit different. And this kind of goes to what some of your answers were about in the chat box when you talk about critical writing, is going a little bit more in depth. So instead of talking about the whole Civil War from 1861 to 1865, you might talk about a specific part of that war. You might talk about, for example, do a whole paper on the Battle of Gettysburg or some of the other famous battles. Or you might have a paper that does something that talks about the origins of the Civil War. So you're not talking about the Civil War in general from 1861 to 1865, but you might talk about things that led up to the Civil War. Like you might do a whole paper on the Dred Scott case, for instance. You might do a whole paper on Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had a major effect on people's attitudes about slavery, especially in the North. And it really strengthened and emboldened the Northerners' perspective about slavery. Even though a lot of them were already anti-slavery, they were abolitionists, but a book like Harriet Beecher Stowe's really strengthened and even brought more awareness to the evils of slavery. In fact, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the #1 seller of the 19th century, other than the Bible. But yeah, so very, very popular book. In fact, it flew off the shelves, especially not just here, but also in Britain. And remember, England was the first country in the world to outlaw slavery too. Okay, so let me just real quickly. Okay, we might come back to a couple of these slides here, but remember to avoid being general, but rather specific. So once again, in high school, for instance, you might have a paper that talks about, I don't know, women's rights or something like that, and do a whole paper on that. Well, that's fine, but that's a little bit more of a general topic for college. Probably if you are in a history class or even like a gender studies class, you're not going to be asked to write about just a whole paper on women's rights because it's such a broad field. But instead, you might focus on one aspect of that. You might, for instance, focus on women's suffrage in 1920 and just maybe a couple things that led up to that and after that, right? You might write a whole paper on an author named Gloria Steinem, who is very influential in the women's rights movement because she actually, interesting story about Gloria Steinem is that in the 1960s, she went undercover as a Playboy playmate, and it was kind of surreptitious. In other words, it's not like Playboy knew, but she was kind of covering that aspect of how women were treated as a journalist undercover. So you might have a whole paper on something like that, for instance. Or another famous author from the women's rights movement is an author named Betty Friedan, who wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. So you might have a whole paper just on that book, for instance. Also make sure why your argument is important in your paper. What is the burning need? So for example, if you are writing a paper on nursing, then about your field is important. Okay, what is the burning need? Why do people need to know about your field? Why is it important? Why your argument matters? Okay, here. Also, remember to start off your essay with an attention grabber. It can be a question, it can be a quotation, it can be an anecdote. So as I mentioned, if you're doing nursing, you could just start out your essay with, why is nursing important? Okay. Sometimes, like I said, a quotation can be important as an introduction, a very first sentence. For instance, it could be a quotation from somebody or a little anecdote in your introduction, a story. Consider how to conclude your essay. Of course, some students will write their conclusion before they even write the rest of their essay, before they start the rest of their essay. So they'll write their conclusion, then maybe an introduction, and then the body. But sometimes it helps to actually write the conclusion first and then the introduction right after that, because it kind of ties them together. So in a way, it's connection between the two to make sure that your essay goes along those lines. Also, this last point here, thesis must be arguable. Now, what does that mean, would you think? Anyone? What does it mean to have an arguable thesis? It's not just making an argument. Yes, exactly. It can't be a fact, Valerie says. So that, yeah, you can have a counter argument there. Exactly. Open for somebody else's opinion. So for example, if you are writing a paper, I'm just going to give you an example, not a paper, but if you're saying something like, oh, well, the sky is blue. Well, okay, nobody's going to disagree with that, right? Everybody knows that the sky is blue. But if you're writing about something, and I'll give you an example here from the Little Siegel book a little bit later on. But I mean, like, if you're saying like, oh, well, gasoline prices fluctuate because of this, and this, that would be, we'll also talk about qualifying a thesis too, but that would be something that somebody could argue with, right? Because you could say gasoline prices fluctuate mostly because of whatever the argument is, right? And then somebody else could disagree, well, no, it's mostly because of this. So it could be So you want to have something that a reasonable person could disagree with. Another example that might come to mind, we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later on this semester, and I don't want to get too far ahead. I mean, I know this is only English 1101, but you could take a look, and somebody could take a look at a poem or a novel, and they could just evaluate the form of that poem or novel. Like look at the word structure and whatever it might be. And some people might say, hey, that's the best way to evaluate a novel. It's just looking at the form of how it's written and how the characters, etc. And somebody else might disagree with that though, and they might say, well, no, that's not how you should evaluate just a novel or a poem, not just the form of it, but what does it say about society? So the most important part of a novel is looking at the social impact that novel had. It's not just looking at the form of that. So I'm not sure if that made a lot of sense, but we'll kind of get into that a little bit more later this semester, I think. And I assume that a lot of you might have to take English 1102. So if you do have that class with me, we'll have a whole little lecture or a whole little, actually it's going to take more than one, but we'll look at this idea of media literacy. And I mean, you could have a whole semester just on that topic. But like some people think that, hey, the best way to evaluate a song, a poem, a novel, a film is just to look at the form. Other people might say, no, you actually have to look at what that poem, how the poem's effect or the book's effect or the film's effect on society and so forth. And then other people might say, hey, the best way to evaluate a novel is to look at the author themselves and look at how it goes, how that theme of that novel runs through the rest of their work, things like that. So different perspectives. So also remember that when we look at our textbook, as I said, always state the counter argument in your essays. This gives you more credibility in your argument because you're saying, hey, this is my argument, but I at least acknowledge that other people think differently. So it gives you credibility because the reader's going to say, oh, okay, well, at least they know that other people might disagree with them. And remember that the reader will ask why, not just what. So in other words, why is your field important? Not just what. Or if you're doing the first essay on social media's impact, you could say, why is this important? Because where are we going in the future? It might get worse or better in the future. But you're not just talking about what social media's impact is, but why is it important? And also keep in mind, remember that your reader won't always have or be familiar with your subject. So one example that I gave last class, or not last class for you, but I mean earlier this morning, is that there's one example from the technical writing class I taught from that textbook. And I think they were talking about the company Best Buy, okay? And Best Buy was trying to, they did a technical report and they were trying to appeal to other countries or other states, various different states. And the problem is that the report was filled with all this technical jargon that made sense to them, the authors of the report, but it didn't make sense to the readers, the consumers, right? The consumer just wants to know, okay, why is this product good? Why should we invest in you? And the problem is that the report was filled with all these tech things that really didn't have any meaning to the consumers. And keep in mind that your reader will not always be familiar with acronyms that you use. And this is also one of the differences between high school and college, because in high school, keep in mind that the teacher is going to give you a topic, to use the theme of the Civil War again. Write about the Civil War. Give me a summary of the Civil War. Well, the teacher's going to know everything about the Civil War, so they're going to already know what you're talking about. But in college, the great thing about college writing for a lot of the classes that you're going to have, and especially if you go into grad school, I'll tell you that, but a lot of the classes that you're going to have, you're going to be able to choose your topic, what you want to write about. Those, by chance, is anybody consider, I know that a lot of you are just freshmen, of course, but is anybody considering going to grad school one day? Perhaps? Okay, so Carrie says yes. Okay, so in college, if you go to grad school, you're going to be doing something called a thesis. And this is great because they don't give you instructions for that. I mean, there are certain guidelines you have to follow, of course. And of course, you're going to be writing about something that relates to your program or your department. But the great thing is that you get to choose your topic, what you're going to write your thesis on. So this gives you great freedom to be able to choose what you want. So, and that's great. And keep in mind that so your reader won't always be familiar with your subject. So as an example of this, not to get too into personal things, but like at UCF, one of the problems that I have is that the department that I'm in, or that I was in, I kind of transferred over to a different school, but the department I was in didn't have, it was kind of an eclectic program, meaning that they had people from different fields in it, which is great, but they didn't have something specifically for film. Or actually, they did have a guy that would be great for helping me with the dissertation, but he had like 9 other people that he was doing. So, but the point though that I'm making is that your reader won't always be completely familiar with your subject, so you might have to inform them a little bit more about what your argument is about and what you're writing about and so forth. Now, so your textbook gives an example in the introduction about how the they doesn't always have to be from somebody famous. So as an example, of course, for your final project that you'll do in this class, obviously you'll have to find academic sources from our library. And on that note too, if we're in the classroom, I usually bring in somebody from the library and we have have a whole class where she introduces you to how to use the library and so forth. And unfortunately, well, I guess it is fortunate for you because we're all on computers right now. In the classroom, sometimes they have a computer, sometimes they don't. But if they have computers, she'll actually show you how to get to the library system and how to find sources and so forth. Now, I'll say our library is a little bit, it's not, I don't want to say it's tricky, but it's not quite as easy to access it. I mean, it's still okay, don't get me wrong, and I'll kind of walk you through that. We'll have a class where we kind of do that. But if you go to UCF, they have something called the OneSearch, which is very, very convenient because it's literally, you just go on the library site and it's right there. It's called the OneSearch. And so you search for any topic and anything that they have in their resources, it'll come up. But the point though, that to get back to this first bullet point though, is that the they doesn't always have to be from somebody famous or from an academic source all the time. You might have for your essays, here in this class, you can bring something personal, like you can talk about a family member, like an experience they had and how that's going to tie into your paper, something like that. The other thing here too, I'm not going to go read through, all of these, but your textbook, like on pages 10 through 15, they give you some good templates that you can use. Templates like, disagreeing without being disagreeable. So you could, like, they give you a template, like the first thing there, while I understand the impulse to blank, my own view is blank. So it's disagreeing without being disagreeable. Or while I agree with X that blank, I cannot accept her overall conclusion that blank. Or while X argues blank and I argue blank, is in a way we're both right. And it gives you like templates how to do that. It gives you some other things as well. And this whole book, like I said, is kind of filled with good templates. Now, it's not like mandatory you have to follow them, of course, but you can kind of use them at least as a good starting point for your research. And also, okay, sometimes it's helpful to start off your essay by looking at what multiple authors have said. So what I mean by that is, once again, in college, let's just say that you have to write a whole paper on the Battle of Gettysburg. Once again, to keep the theme of the Civil War, I guess. Rather than just starting out by just talking about what the history of it and so forth, if you're making an argumentative paper, then you might want to start out like with a quote or the beginning part of your essay, not necessarily in the introduction, but you want to maybe focus on what some author has said about the topic. So you might come across in your research what an author says, well, the Battle of Civil War of the Gettysburg wasn't as didn't have much of an effect on the conclusion as some authors might think. And so you would maybe start off by talking about that author. And then you might find another author that says, actually, the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. Or if you're doing World War II, you could say that the Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point of the war, something like that, But find a specific author, and once again, that's kind of the point of the book, is finding out what they say and what you say about it. So that's kind of a good way to approach it. It's a good, I'll give you a personal story about how I used to do research papers. Now, these research papers were a little bit longer than yours, but I would actually go through with the research, and I would actually, before even starting the essay, I would find quotes from different sources and have those quotes handy. And then I could kind of build my paper around those quotes. And before we get to the first essay, I'll show you a formula that you can use that I think is very, very helpful for students in terms of how to structure your paragraphs and how to structure your essay. So it also will help you add length to your paper. Once again, the papers in this class aren't that long, but maybe for your future classes, it might be like a kind of a template to follow. Once again, think specific, not general. So once again, as I said, I had a whole class on Jane Austen, one author, okay? So in college, we get more specific, not just general. And I mean, it could even go further. You could have a whole class on just like 2 books, believe it or not. You could have a whole class on War and Peace by Tolstoy. So it gets a lot more specific in college, not just general. So it's one of the differences between high school and college writing. Now, and also they give you more templates on pages 23 through 28. Once again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll see them here. I mean, templates for introducing what they say. So for example, a number of sociologists have recently suggested that X's work has several fundamental problems. Or another way would be, it has become common today to dismiss blank, and so forth. They have templates on making what they say something you say. So I've always believed that museums are boring. Or when I was a child, I used to think that blank. And then they have templates on page 25 here for introducing something implied or assumed. So as an example, one implication of X's treatment of blank is that blank. So things like that. They have templates for introducing an ongoing debate. And so this book has lots of templates that you could follow. And I mean, like in class, we used to do, on page 29 here, we used to do an in-class exercise on if you're looking down here on number 1, A through F. We're not going to do that here, but just some things to maybe think about or read about. And that pretty much sums up chapter 1. Now let's look here at the little seagull for a bit. Remember the importance of context. So obviously, if you're writing for an assignment, that's pretty straightforward. If you're writing an abstract, Does anybody know offhand what an abstract is? Maybe you could think of an abstract as just kind of a short little summary in your paper. Now, the interesting thing about abstracts is that for some of you that might be going into fields like psychology, you'll be using APA format. Technically speaking, APA format requires an abstract. So that's something to consider. Just a kind of a short, brief introduction to your paper. Now, in the technical fields, there are different types of abstracts, two main types, I should say. One is the descriptive abstract. That just is about what your paper is going to be about. The informative abstract is essentially an entire summary of what your paper is and the results that you find or your argument in just like a short paragraph. Now, when you do your research later on this semester, one thing to consider that you have to consider really is that when you're finding sources from the library, you're dealing with articles, academic articles that are very long. So rather than finding 10 articles and reading all of them, first approach the abstract and consider that abstract before even reading further, like to find out if that source is going to be relevant to what your paper is going to be about. And that'll be helpful because the abstract is very, very helpful in terms of determining whether that particular article is going to be something that you can use or not. Now, I will say too, well, actually, I'll get to word count here in a second. Now, are you writing a paper for a conference? This is something to consider too, because keep in mind that when you're writing a paper for a conference, this paper is going to be something that you're going to have to read out loud. So the tone might be a little bit different, okay? Like as an example, my thesis advisor, when he used to go to this conference, he would pay close attention to alliteration. So that just means like using like words that with the same consonant back to back, just because it sounded better, because he was going to be presenting like a paper in front of people. Whereas if you're writing a paper for a class, you're not going to necessarily be, you don't necessarily have to do a presentation on it, although sometimes maybe you do as well. But are you writing a petition, perhaps? This fourth bullet point here. Now, you're not this textbook, but another textbook that I used to teach from for 1101 talked about a group of students on a college campus that wrote a petition to their university professor, or their university president, I mean. And it was just about how the maintenance workers were underappreciated and how they should get a raise. Or one example might be that, I'm not sure if they still do this, but at Valencia, the Poinciana campus, I think there used to be a rule about bikes or something like that. Like your bike had to be, parked, if you will, on a certain side of campus. And I think like a group of students were upset about that. So they got together and maybe wrote a short petition and got it changed. Also, how long or short should it be? Now for this class, you don't really have to worry about length. I mean, there are minimum requirements, of course, but I want to go back to this note though of abstract. And when we talk about length, because it sounds crazy, but sometimes you'll be submitting, if you ever want to publish for like an article for a journal or something like that, sometimes the abstract will have certain rules. Like it has to be between 290 to 310 words. Can't be any shorter or any longer than that. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. Sometimes those are the requirements. Also, I was talking earlier this morning to the other class where if you ever are interested in going to the creative field, like writing a novel, for instance, there's going to be books in the industry. They're I forget what they're called offhand, but they're books where you can find agents and agencies, and each agent wants something different. So some of them will require a one-page summary of your book. Other people might want what they call a book treatment, which is kind of a brief overview of the plot and then character description, setting description, conclusion, etc., things like that. Other agents will just want just a short little one paragraph summary or a pitch as to what it is. And it's very frustrating as a writer because it's like you have to do all these different things for each agent, but it's one of the facts of the industry, I guess. And then also what readers are expecting from your paper. Also consider the audience. The Little Seagull talks about genre. Is your paper going to be argumentative? For most papers that you're going to be writing in college, you are going to be writing an argumentative paper where you're making a position about something. Other papers might be just informative, where you're trying to inform the reader. So to give you that Best Buy example that I was talking about, the writers should have been just more informative in terms of explaining this to the potential investors, how their plan is going to work, but you're just trying to be informative. Sometimes you'll be writing a book review or a film review, so take that in consideration. Like, what are you reviewing? Sometimes it can be a technical report, like I talked about, which is different than most academic writing. Technical writing involves more like bullet points, usually doesn't have like a format to follow, like MLA or APA, things like that. Also, if you're doing a presentation, which sometimes you'll have to do for some of your classes, not in this class, but in some of your classes, you might have to do a presentation. What images should you show? So I'm not sure if you guys have been paying attention to the news lately, but Elon Musk is now coming out with this, or he wants to come out with like a little chip that they can put in your brain that's going to solve a lot of neurological functions, I think. And, you know, when he makes a pitch to somebody or tries to introduce this to the audience, he has to do a presentation. So it's like, what images or what videos or what graphs should you show? So that's something that you have to do sometimes in the industry, is like make a presentation. Now, sometimes in your classes, you might have to do what we call a narrated keynote or narrated PowerPoint. And so in that, there might be time restrictions and things like that. If you're doing a narrated keynote, there's something called PechaKucha, which I think is like, I don't know, 10 slides, 20 seconds each, or something like that. I'm not sure, but there might be certain guidelines to follow. Are you writing a summary? So just explaining the summary of the book or the movie or the film, whatever you're going into. Are you doing a compare and contrast where you're comparing maybe two different books from an author, or you're comparing this author with another author, or this book with another book, etc.? Does anybody know what a close reading is? By chance? Yeah, so a close reading is essentially where you take a passage of something and you look at each individual word or each individual line. For example, in poetry, some people might look at a poem and they might just kind of read through it without really paying attention too much to the author's diction, which is word choice. But a close reading might be to examine why this writer, why this poet used this word here, this word there. Some poems have a visual style to it, what they call shape poems. And so close reading just means being able to look at a passage of something and examine it in more detail than you would if you were just reading it as normal. And just a couple other things here. We're out of time, and I almost out of time, and I just want to answer any questions that we might have. But also, what tone should you use? Now, if you're writing an argumentative paper, a lot of times you're going to be a little bit more forceful. That doesn't mean like nasty, but you might be a little bit more bold in your tone. If you know, some newspapers, there might be bias to the content, but if you look at like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you'll know that their tone is very sort of friendly, if you will. They refer to people as Mr. or Ms. So it's kind of a different style, even though sometimes they're making arguments at the editorial page, you know, or if you're looking at a movie review, but still they're very respectful in their tone. Also, what style you should use, where, you know, some of you that are going into psychology might be using APA. In this class, we use MLA. If you are going into history, they use something called Chicago style, which I'm not too familiar with. I think I had to write one paper when I was in school for a history class that was in Chicago style. I will say that I think that MLA is a little bit easier than APA. The rules are similar. They're slightly different with citations. And well, at least it used to be, APA used, they used to have like 2 running heads on the first page, which kind of confused a lot of students. I'm not sure if they still do that now. And here's a little inside secret that they don't want you to know about, but MLA and APA, they kind of change a rule every year, like a citation rule, or their content is going to be a little bit different. The reason why they do that, it's kind of a little bit not so good, but it's true that they just want you or the schools to buy the new edition of the book. But in general, the styles don't change too much. And again, we'll go over those. Make sure to use qualifying words in your thesis. So what that means, great example on page of the little Siegel book here. I think it's on page 10. Yeah, so what that means is that they give you an example here. Gasoline prices fluctuate because of production procedures, consumer demand, international policies, and companies' policies, et cetera. Okay, that's good. It's a good thesis, but it's more like absolute. It's like, this is my opinion, and anybody else that disagrees with it is wrong. What's better is to say gasoline prices very likely fluctuate because of production procedures, consumer demand, et cetera. So you don't want to be just absolute, like, this is your opinion, nobody could disagree. Because remember, your thesis should be arguable, that a reasonable person can disagree. Okay, just the last thing here, before I answer any questions, and we're almost out of time here, but this is something that we do in class, but we don't really have the time to do it here. But usually what I'll do at the end of many classes is I'll give you a list of vocabulary words. This is nothing going to be quizzed on or anything like that, but I had a student one time that, you know, English was a second language, and he was trying to get familiar with some vocabulary words. And what I did is I pull words from the GRE, the most commonly used words on the GRE. The GRE is very similar to the SAT or the ACT, if you've taken that. It's just for grad school. But these are just a list of common words that are used that can maybe strengthen your vocabulary. What I usually do in class is we'll look up each of the words, and then you come up with your own sentence, how to use them. So maybe at the end of the semester, I'll give you a list of all these words that you can kind of keep with you if you want to. But basically, just real quickly, plethora means a lot. So you could say that, boy, that movie sure had a lot of plethora of colors used in its content. Ubiquitous just means kind of widespread. So you could say that, wow, advertising these days is really widespread, or texting these days is very ubiquitous. Zeal just means like with great enthusiasm. So you could say that that author had great zeal with their argument. Arduous just means, you know, difficult or something like that. So you could say that, boy, that assignment was very arduous. And redundant just means simply repetitive. So this author's argument was very redundant because he or she, you know, said the same thing over and over again or something like that. So at this point, does anybody have any questions here before we wrap up? Okay, so Valerie says no. Okay, good. So just remember, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that the last class talked or had. real quickly, somebody asked if you buy the books from Amazon, will they have the code for the lab? I can't really say for sure. If you buy it used, then probably not. If you buy it new, probably yes, but I can't give you a definite answer to that. So Valerie says, what's the next thing to do? So basically just the reading assignment for this week is what's due. If you go to, back to our page, just go to assignments here and just go to the reading assignment. And once again, it's just to take a look at the first few chapters of They Say, I Say. Just choose a passage that you think you find important or relevant in regards to your future academic writing. And then just read the Blanda's article. It's not that long. It's just like 3 or 4 pages. And just maybe you can pick one of the questions, or you can just write a general response. What do you think about that? The last thing before I forget though, I just want to point out is that the lab itself, now why they didn't publish this last week, I don't know. I really don't have any control of this. I guess I can see the grades and stuff like that. But if you do have any questions with the lab, you have to contact that instructor because I really don't have access to much here. I will just say though, in the past, from what I know actually, is that the lab assignments are not too intensive. It's basically like, you do the work, and if you they'll ask you a question, and if you get it wrong, I think they'll give you like 3 opportunities to get it right. It's very, very simple. People that have done it in the past say that it's very, very easy, but the only thing is to make sure to keep up with it and the due dates that are on there. That's just the main thing, is to just keep up with that. So everyone, I just want to thank you guys for showing up. I apologize that we had some issues with the Zoom last week. In fact, even this morning, we all got briefly disconnected, but everything's fine. So I think Zoom should be okay for the rest of the semester. I know that like last week, I know that a lot of high schools had a lot of issues with Zoom. That's because everybody in the world now is basically using Zoom. And I'm not sure if you guys paid attention to the news today, this morning, a lot of colleges now, they're in a real bind because they are, the virus is spreading. However, just in the last 3 minutes, I just want to explain something though too, about the coronavirus. There was a great article from the New York Times that's very encouraging actually, that came out I think on Friday. And what they're finding now, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's very scientific and everything, but what they're finding now is that a lot of people that were tested positive should have actually been tested negative. I think in the state of Massachusetts, they said something like 90% of people from July that tested positive would have actually tested negative if they did the cycles a different way. So it's, yeah, the virus is spreading, it's bad, but it might not be as bad as we thought. And we're probably gonna have a vaccine for it pretty soon. So that's encouraging. And another study that just came out that said that the death rate, the fatality rate, like the people that are passing away tend to have a lot of underlying issues anyways. So, but hopefully we're all dealing with this and we'll get by it eventually. So, yeah, so thanks for attending. We'll see everybody on Wednesday. And like I said, I'm trying to post the links for both classes. So there's no issue. I think that Zoom can hold up to like 100 people or something like that. So there's no issue. If you want to attend the 8 o'clock class, the 9:30 class, either one is fine. It's the same exact class. And of course, I'll put the recordings up after every class, so you can always go back to those. So thanks everybody for attending, and we will see everybody Wednesday.